Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast, where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. We're back, and I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you are up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, well, just in time for August to end, I have brought a monthly book to the table for us to talk about today. The book is called The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. Mm-hmm. It was written by Alana Lentin, and it was published by Pluto Press earlier this year. And like, what a whopper of a book, right?
Yeah.
Like the book itself is really, I think, dense and detailed and thorough. And it really struck me as sort of an academic read, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, it was great. And to say I learned a lot from this book would be an incredible understatement. There's just so much in this book. It's an exploration and analysis of how the attacks on anticolonial, Black, Indigenous thought, life, praxis have shown us time and time again how racial colonial rule is ingrained in our collective society.
Yep.
And Alana presents this concept of the new racial regime, which she built from the work of Cedric Robinson, who she references throughout this book, who conceptualized the concept of and framework of racial capitalism and the racial regime. And so I don't know that this will do this justice, but as a really basic description, the book explores how white supremacy and racial capitalism and the new racial regime have been maintained and sustained and recalibrated throughout history, and who the key actors in that work have been and the impact of that on our society and on us. And the book also highlights how and what resistance has looked like against the rise and the manifestations of white supremacy and racial capitalism, and the impact that work has had as well. And it's certainly, I think, the book itself is really a call for that resistance work to continue. Yeah. And so the book has 5 chapters in it after its foreword and its introduction. The first chapter is called A Drop of Poison, What the War on Critical Race Theory Tells Us About the New Racial Regime. Chapter 2 is called On History and the Technologies of White Forgetting. Chapter 3 is titled Institutionalizing Dissent in a Time of Genocide. Chapter 4 is Capturing Indigeneity, Colonizing Decolonization. And the final chapter is called Against Definitions. So, yeah, there's literally so much we could talk about from this book, but where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, I think this is one of those books that lodges such a heavy critique at the systems in place that it shifts the way that I think about some of the critiques I have of those systems.
Yes.
It makes you reconsider so much about the assumptions of both the hierarchies of racial capitalism and the way we even frame our critiques of it.
Yes.
And so one of the points that Alana Lentin makes in the introduction highlights what is, I think, at the core of her conceptualization of the new racial regime. So she says it, quote, starts with the war on critical race theory, expanding from there to interrogate a wider question. How is racial common sense produced and reproduced today? Why does race remain a central mechanism for organizing the material and structural relations between groups of people who are constituted as wholly different from each other? How is this fundamentally fictive process of differentiation represented to us through a variety of media? How do these representations change, often contradicting each other? In short, how do we weave a way through what Robinson insisted was the intrinsically chaotic nature of race's manufacture?
Wow.
Yeah, and it really gets at the core of so much of what's happening in the context of the Trump regime right now, and the continued genocide in Palestine. And she lays out some of these questions, and it points to the chapters you mentioned before. I think this is one of the thesis statements of questions, so to speak, of what she's going to explore throughout the book.
Absolutely.
And I really, on reflection, appreciate the questions, both because it gives you that map of where we're going in the book, but it also helps highlight what are the they're just good questions.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
just help you reconsider a lot about what's going on in the world around us. And, she talks about a lot of the examples of the new racial regime and how slippery it is as the hierarchies it creates shift with time and with priorities of states and capitalisms and corporations and whatnot. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it was a great read and a lot to consider and make you reconsider
Absolutely.
as
I love
I
that.
read through it. Yeah.
I didn't really think about that, but this idea of it sort of shifting my thinking around some of this stuff, I think is absolutely spot on. And I think you're right. These questions serve as a thesis, and they are great questions that are revisited in every single chapter in various ways. And she shows us how the issues presented from these questions are manifested in the various ways in which the new racial regime is operating. So I love those questions, and it's a good reminder that it was a really common theme throughout the book. Mm-hmm. So you talked about the introduction. There's so much to me that stood out from the first chapter of the book. Again, it's called A Drop of Poison: What the War on Critical Race Theory Tells Us. And part of why it was so powerful to me was because Alana did such a beautiful job walking us through the history of the attacks on anti-racism efforts here in the United States, but also around the world, and the various forms that these attacks have taken. And so for me, it was wild to sort of see mentions of terms like political correctness and reverse discrimination, diversity hires, anti-wokeness, and so many more. And it took me back to all of the ways in which white supremacy and this new racial regime, again, have been manifested and recalibrated to meet the time that we're in. Like, there were one example that stands out to me was the Rodney King incident. And so that's mentioned and analyzed in this chapter. And so it was just kind of a walk down memory lane, if you will, reading that chapter and seeing all of the examples that she provided in it. But one of the things she talked about in the context of all of this was the threat that this poses to the continuation of fascism, which, of course gave me some pause because, as I check my notes, we're living through that right now. Right?
What?
Yeah, surprise. No, not a surprise to anybody.
No.
So she says, quote, during the 1990s panic over multiculturalism, repeated and intensified in the 2000s, Cedric Robinson argued that those defending adjustments made in the name of institutional inclusion, principally affirmative action in the U.S., avoided the concomitant existence of a racist multiculturalism that emphasized relative difference in order to conceal the prerogatives of power. Robinson was concerned that complex questions to do both with domestic racism and capitalist exploitation, as well as U.S. militarism in the context of imperial decline and the decay of the global economy, were being recentered around an oversimplification of racial identities. The very real concern that Robinson noted in the 1990s was that racial capitalism finds its natural end in fascism, a fact which Black people ignore at their peril because it is they who face the brunt of it. Ruth Wilson Gilmore agrees, noting that unequal institutions, most notably education and the legal system, lay the ground for a more secure fascism. And in particular, it was that end of that quote that kind of stopped me, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's words, because they're brilliant. But they stopped me in my tracks because it's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing these attacks on education. We're seeing attacks on and a rigging of the judiciary in favor of authoritarianism in the executive. And to me, all of that is out of the fascism playbook. And, we're just living it right now. And we see in this chapter how that has been built year after year in this country, right?
Hearing you talk about it, for me, clarifies how much of what's happening right now is a reaction to some very slight progress made in making these institutions more equal, which is her point, right? Like, the unequal institutions are the things that lay a ground for more secure fascism because it helps stratify us from one another.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing get reinscribed now is this sense of unequal institutions and things being for people. And that's why things like DEI, which are inherently really about making institutions more equal, right? Like, inclusion is including people who haven't been included in the past.
Right.
Like, that's what, in essence, that means.
Yep.
So doing away with that is reinscribing these unequal institutions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that thought. Like this, it's all a reaction to progress.
Yeah.
Right. At every step of the way, we see this intensify and recalibrate. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and it's all fear based.
Oh, yeah.
I think about some of the other things we've talked about on the show too, where we talked about it with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act piece that we read from the Center for American Progress. They talked in that about access to financial aid and the way that was being cut back, and alongside that, the way that student debt relief was being cut.
Yes.
And we talked about that in the context of just access to higher education, but that's another way that this happens.
Yes.
Is creating more unequal institutions and unequal access to these institutions.
Absolutely.
Whew. All right.
Good connection
What
there.
a word.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the other things that stood out to me was in chapter 3, which is institutionalizing dissent in a time of genocide. So she says, quote, on Martin Luther King Day 2024, the official count of the Israeli government tweeted a quote attributed to Dr. King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. A twisted echo of Benjamin Netanyahu's later deleted claim that the genocide of Gaza was a, quote, struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. And then she goes on to talk about, quote, the ADL promotes a carceral approach to tackling racism, which it characterizes as hate, thus not only decoupling individual acts of racist aggression from the operations of the racial state, but also establishing a framework for the generalization of racism to any perceived vilification on the basis of group affiliation. So the first thing I thought about this here was the post that the FBI makes during MLK Day, honoring him, so to speak, and acknowledging the holiday, I guess, when they were really in the driver's seat for vilifying him.
Yep.
And ultimately
worse.
leading to his death.
Yep.
Even if we can't directly attribute his assassination to the FBI, which is suspect at best, we can say that they helped lead the charge to create the conditions in which he was assassinated.
Absolutely.
And that is well documented. And so, seeing the Israeli government tweet that reminded me of what the FBI does every year.
Yep.
And this also reminds me of Olufemi Taiwo's arguments about elite capture that we read a few years ago now, where states and agencies use the language, theories, and programs of radicals and activists to blunt the rest of their work and defang it, really. And I think this point about the carceral approach of the ADL makes so much sense in comparison to all of this.
Yeah.
Because they're really just directly related to it. They've had a lot of influence in steering the conversations about discrimination in all kinds of institutions and culturally.
Yep.
And they take a concept like racism and they individualize it by emphasizing that it's about hate, which is an individual emotional response rather than seeing the systems that create the emotional response in individuals overall.
Absolutely.
And it also reminds me of a story that happened recently in the West Bank, where a quote-unquote unaffiliated settler, unaffiliated with the Israeli government, shot and killed one of the co-directors of the film whose title I can't remember now, that just won an Oscar.
Right.
And so he gets sanctioned, I believe. He got arrested and sanctioned. And so, we see the Israeli government sort of paralleling this concept too, where they're individualizing his actions and separating it from the system that they've created and that they're supporting in terms of settling the West Bank and really creating the context for removing Palestinians from their homes so that they can then take it over, or that land can be sold to people who want to move there, who have said that they have a claim to the land. And so I'm just seeing all these parallels of the ways
absolutely.
that
There's a lot of connections there.
there's individualization of what is called hate, and that happening in a particular context that's separate, so to speak, from the institutionalized systemic processes that occur and that those things are okay because they happen in a quote unquote official way.
Right.
But the individualized hate, so to speak, is not acceptable, at least on face value.
Yeah.
And so I'm tying a lot of things in here,
Yeah.
and I hope it's making sense. But
Yeah.
all of these things are coming to me as we talk about, MLK quotes being used by the FBI or used by the Israeli government, and the ways that violence gets individualized, and we see it only happen by the individual and not seeing that as part of a bigger system in which the individual is participating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, it's what stood out to me about what you just said there was that, it's this idea that it's a distraction, right? It's a distraction to point to the individual and to give us an enemy that isn't the state, and to draw our attention away from what the state is doing, when really what the state is doing is set up the conditions for these things to happen in so many ways. And also the work of the state and the violence of the state is so atrocious, and in this case, an atrocity at the level of a genocide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I also just really hate the use of MLK quotes in ways that are just so nefarious and so wrong. And
Right.
yeah. I'm glad you talked about chapter 3. I want to stay there for a bit. Also, the title of that chapter is so powerful. Yeah. And it sort of brilliantly, I think, matches what Alana writes about in this chapter. For me, the common thread and through line in this chapter is how the new racial regime and white supremacy are being weaponized to protect one population over all others. And there's lots of examples of that in this chapter. For me right now, it's this context of the war on anti-Semitism, and a huge site of that war being waged is on college and university campuses. So Alana says, quote, "Here we can observe the coming together of two wars, the war on CRT and what the Palestinian race scholar Anna Eunice calls the war on anti-Semitism. In Eunice's account, the ostensible fight against anti-Semitism wields the repressive and technical apparatuses of the state to manage non-white migration in an ethnically diverse yet white supremacist Europe. Far from being concerned with the protection of all Jewish people from racism, the war on anti-Semitism is waged by managing, criminalizing, and targeting migrant, refugee, and of-color communities with the figure of the Palestinian anti-Semite as its main culprit." And so then a little bit later on, she says, quote, "The war on anti-Semitism piggybacks on the war of critical race theory, painting CRT and related disciplines, ethnic studies primarily, as uniquely anti-Semitic, providing the theoretical underpinnings for pro-Palestinian radicalism, and being purportedly hostile to Jews whose allegiance to Zionism goes unquestioned. During the Gaza genocide, schools and universities, already primed by authoritarianism and conjoined state philo-Semitism of the war on anti-Semitism, resulting in the repression of pro-Palestinian speech and the targeting of Palestinians and their supporters, became sites of full-throated state repression from New York to Amsterdam, Berlin, and Paris. Emory University, close to the site earmarked for the building of Atlanta's privately funded Cop City, saw some of the worst police violence against students and staff in April 2024. And there's a lot there to digest, but I especially appreciated Alana's use of Emory University as an example of the attacks on colleges and universities because of its proximity to Cop City, which we've talked about on the podcast several times. I thought it was an incredible example because it is a brilliant example and case study of the state's mission and of state violence. It's the state saying, we will not stand for dissent and protest against our role in the genocide of Palestinian people over here. So sit down, stand down, students and staff of Emory. And meanwhile, don't mind the fact that just miles down the road from here, we're building this facility to train soldiers in our war to enact violence against you and others in our state. Like, it's just wild to comprehend. And so I just, that example really kind of got me.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think Cop City has done so clearly, and the development of it, the fundraising for it, the work against it, is clearly define the ways that the state is militarizing. And we've seen a lot more analysis of that over the course of the last 10, 15 years in the wake of Ferguson and other places where we've seen heavily militarized police response to protests.
Yes.
And I think Cop City made it so clear that this is what's happening.
Yes.
That we're creating a facility in which cops can practice urban warfare.
Yep.
And so that's easy to then tie into something like the IDF and what they do in Gaza and in the West Bank.
Absolutely.
Especially in the context of us having read the Palestinian Laboratory last year. And
Yes.
so all of these things, we can tie them all in together as well.
Absolutely.
So
Great point.
apparently that's where my mind is right now. It's just bringing in
I
all
love
this
it.
stuff.
I love it. Keep going.
All right. Well, there's a powerful question in chapter 5 called Against Definitions, where Alana Lentin challenges the very notions of when race is considered to have been invented. She says, quote, "How is it possible to assume that a phenomenon of such great historical force as race hatches fully formed at specific moments? Why would there be little curiosity, as Verdi puts it, to conduct the empirical investigation to corroborate the thesis that race appears in pre-modernity rather than dismiss it out of hand?" So this pushes against the Western theories on when race and racism was created to organize power into hierarchies, which has continued to evolve, as illustrated throughout the book and the different examples we've read through and talked about here a little bit.
Yeah.
But she points out, grounded in arguments from other scholars, that intra-European colonization was most of the foundation for what would become the system of white supremacy and racial capitalism. Race was not just invented so that Europeans could consider themselves superior to African people and therefore give them an argument for why enslavement was acceptable. It was something that evolved,
Right.
and it was used as a tool to reinforce the arguments for enslavement, but it existed previously, and it evolved in similar ways to how the racial regime evolves now and is slippery and hard to catch and wrap your
Yeah.
arms around now because it's evolved in similar ways over the course of many centuries beyond how we sort of conceptualize it now.
Yeah, that evolution piece I think is really key, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it such a difficult topic, and it's why we as a society are wrestling with this, because it's something that is complicated and is hard to understand and changes to, again, as we talked about earlier, to meet the needs of whatever is being whatever is happening. But that doesn't mean that we should turn to things like authoritarianism and fascism, right? We should really be doing our best to fight against all of that.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the
Yeah.
opposite, in fact. All right. Well, again, I feel like there's so much we could talk about from this book, but let's shift our conversation over to the application portion of our show. It's been a minute. So this is where we talk about how the book and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. I think there's so much to take away from this book that's particularly useful and helpful as a context for the world we find ourselves in right now, and definitely here in the United States. It's pretty easy to see and to name how we're living in a white supremacist and fascist state, especially as tanks, literal tanks, roll down the street of Washington, D.C., as you and I sit here right now and record this conversation. And so for me, this book provided some great context for that. One of the things Alana talked about and said early on in the book was all about the dangers of white supremacy in the context of the new racial regime. So she says, quote, "The ways in which whiteness is partially detached from actual white bodies and integrated into a politics and a consequent individual consciousness beyond the West signals the adaptive nature of the racial regime. This whiteness, which always already implies supremacism, is recalibrated in various ways over time, eventually becoming attached to what Dylan Rodriguez calls multiculturalist white supremacy. The capacity for recalibration inherent to white supremacy demonstrates that, despite appearances to the contrary, the world has not exited a racial regime where whiteness, reproduced through capitalism and ongoing forms of imperialism, has been superseded." And I think that's a powerful analysis and message there about the ways in which white supremacy has been and is ingrained and integrated into our politics, our our individual and collective consciences, and what that has meant for and the impact it's had on our society. And it's, to me, it's just an analysis that I appreciate and I'm going to take with me from this book. What about you?
Yeah, that's a powerful one.
Yeah.
My application comes from chapter 5,
Okay.
where she says, quote, "What is posed to the public as a problem changes over time based on political requirements, and most people accept the propaganda they are served. The racial regime provides the requisite narrative of threat, not least via mass propaganda, to smooth this acceptance." We've made similar arguments about this here before based on other pieces of media, but I think this is an important point for this book.
Yeah.
The racial regime shifts with time based on its priorities or the priorities of the transnational corporations of the day. We're told what's a threat based on these priorities, and then we're sold solutions to
Yes.
these threats. And it's super obvious right now. As you mentioned, we watch National Guards from multiple states, the Metro PD, and ICE agents all descend on D.C. based on a so-called crime wave in a city in which the data says the opposite
Completely
is
different.
happening.
Yes.
And we're told that crime is a threat to us in the nation's capital, and that means it's a threat everywhere. So the solution is to mobilize military and state agencies to root out the problem, which are inherently black and brown people who have been labeled criminals by the racial regime for centuries.
Yes.
And so this pattern repeats itself over and over again. And then if you also take a step back and you think about what is crime and who is criminalized and what are the actions that are criminalized versus the actions that are not criminalized,
Right.
we also have an idea of what that means for the racial regime. Because again, we tie it back to individuals that are criminalized.
Right.
And the transnational corporations that have committed crimes against humanity over the course of these centuries are not held accountable or not criminalized. The banker who collapses entire portfolios of retirement accounts,
Yep.
not criminalized.
Right.
But if I'm working retail and I steal $100 from the till because I need some extra money for some groceries for my family,
Criminal.
criminal.
Yes.
But what's the difference?
Absolutely.
Right? Millions and millions of dollars is the difference.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, how many people are harmed
Right.
is a huge difference. But
Yet.
the individual person who has a minimal impact is the one who gets criminalized.
Yeah,
and so
persecuted.
you see that also play out here too, of like what's posed as an actual problem by the racial regime and what's the solution to that problem.
Right.
Those are all different things and different questions, and it's supposed to be slippery and confusing and create distractions. Like, I think about to the question we had a couple weeks ago of what's the argument we make today that'll be used against us in the future. And that's the same deal now. If we're arguing about crime statistics instead of arguing that this isn't what should be happening, we're having a different conversation.
Yes.
And so in a couple of years, when we're arguing about crime statistics again, instead of what should be the power of the administration, those are different conversations. And we should be thoughtful about how we approach what our dissent looks like.
Yes. 100%.
Yeah.
Wow. Brilliant application, my friend. All right. Well, let's talk about our homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave this table? I mentioned this earlier. This book was incredibly dense, incredibly thorough, and in the best ways possible.
Yeah.
But I definitely need and want to revisit it. So much of the analysis in this book was centered around and built on really interesting and detailed history and histories and references. And it was a lot to take in all of that and digest it in my first read. So my homework is just simply to revisit this book. Also, when I was preparing for today, I found that Pluto Press has a podcast called Radicals in Conversation.
Okay.
And Alana Lentin was featured on it in an episode talking about this book and all of the incredible ideas she discusses in it. So I'd like to check that out as well, sort of a complement to this book and the learning that we did in it.
Cool.
So yeah, that's my homework. What about you?
Yeah, my homework is to read a pamphlet that Dr. Lentin references in chapter 3, the pamphlet is called Who is Oakland? Anti-Oppression Activism, the Politics of Safety and State Co-optation. I want to read this because they make an important point that is, quote, "It is a well-worn activist formula to point out that representatives of different identity categories must be placed front and center in struggles against racism, sexism, and homophobia. But this is meaningless without also specifying the content of their politics. And I think that's crucial when we're trying to parse through the shape-shifting elements of the new racial regime.
Yes.
Are we being misled by people who are attempting to manipulate us into believing a new version of the same story? Or are we paying attention to someone who is concerned with the liberation for all people?
Ooh.
And I think those are different things, but they can sound similar
Yes, absolutely.
on the face of it. Also, it would be interesting to read Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, which
Yeah.
is one of the foundations for many of the arguments laid
Yes.
out in this book. So I wanted to shout that out too, and maybe we get to that one day.
Absolutely. I love that. Add that to the list. And also, that pamphlet sounds incredible. So that might be worth bringing that to the table sooner rather than later. So I love that. All right. Well, that's our conversation about the new racial regime. It's an incredible book. Encourage folks to check it out. And with that, Aaron, my friend, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. Well, Hammer and Hope released a new issue just last week.
Yes.
I think. So I'm bringing an article from that, which is called "Where Was the Resistance to Trump's Mega Bill of Debt, Death, and Deportation," which was written by Dr. Shamel Bell. The subtitle is, quote, "As Democrats dithered, the organizers among us who could have offered the most potent resistance were overwhelmed and scattered, fighting on multiple fronts." So I haven't read much of it at all. This should be a fascinating read about how overstretched so many organizers are on resisting the persistent fascism of the Trump regime on all the different fronts that they continue to present to be resisted.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading that one. Good pick. All right, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, it has been a couple of weeks. Please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.